They were already chuckling that the old miner had filed on ground no man could winter, for in that country a man measured his winter by the cordwood he had cut against it, and here was Ansel Merrow, past 60 and gray as the sage, taking up the one piece of the basin that had been offered free to every homesteader who came through and taken by none of them. A stinking, steaming sulphur draw 2 miles from the nearest good timber, where the ground smelled of struck matches and the snow would not lie. In the autumn of 1889, in a high, cold sage and lava basin called Kettle Basin, away up in the Wyoming Territory, Ansel cut almost no wood at all. He spent the whole of the good building weather boring lodgepole logs hollow with an auger, end to end, and fitting them one into another to make a wooden pipe, while all around the basin the men who had done well at the crossing stacked their cordwood higher, and chuckled at him in amused disbelief for a foolish old man who had built himself a house where there was no wood. What none of them troubled to consider, and what the winter to come would teach them at a hard price to their fine houses and their woodpiles, was that on a high basin the true enemy of a winter was never the cold, which any stove can answer for an hour, but the fuel a man must go on reaching for, hour upon hour, until the day the reaching stops. And that the hot seep running out of the lava at the head of that worthless draw was the single most perfect answer to that problem that anyone in the territory had ever stumbled upon. He had come into the basin carrying an old trade and very little else. He was a lean, stooped, weather-darkened, deliberate man of past 60, gray-bearded, and slow of speech, with the flattened knuckles and the ruined shoulder of a man who had spent his working life underground, and he had come to Kettle Basin the way a great many old miners came to such places at the end of a long run of other men's fortunes, with a grubstake, a wagon, and a body that would not take another season on the drills. He had been a hard rock miner all his years, most of 'em on the Comstock, down in the deep drifts under the mountain, and it was there, in the hot dark at the bottom of the shafts, that he had learned the one thing that would matter to him ever after. He shared his outfit now with a partner from those years, a broad, cheerful, plain-spoken man of about 42 named Reuben Latch, who had come out of the same shafts with the same ruined back and a great deal more talk, and who had thought the sulphur draw a poor joke for about 6 weeks, and then, having felt the floor of that cabin in November, would defend it to any man in the basin who cared to argue. They were not poor in the way the basin meant it, though they were poor enough. They were poor in the new coin of squared timber and fine stoves and towering cordwood stacks, and rich in a thing the basin had never once thought to count. For Ansel knew one plain thing in his bones that the prosperous men around him had never had any cause to learn, because they measured a winter house by the stove it held and the wood it could stack, and not by what the house was truly being asked to do. It was this, that the earth is warm, not the skin of it which freezes hard as iron and takes the frost down 5 feet in a high basin, but the body of it, which is warm always and everywhere, and has never once in the whole history of the world gone out. He had not read it in a book. He had learned it with his hands, 1,000 feet under a mountain, in drifts where the rock face was too hot to lean on and the water that seeped from it came out scalding, where the company hauled ice down the shafts by the ton so that men could go on working at all, and where a man came off shift in the depth of a mountain winter, stripped to the waist and steaming in the cold air like a run. Hoarse. Every miner who ever went deep knew it. Almost nobody else had any reason to, and in a very few places the deep warmth finds a crack and comes up on its own and stands at the surface, running out of the ground, hot for anyone at all to use, and one of those places was a worthless sulfur draw at the south end of Kettle Basin that a dozen homesteaders had walked away from because it stank and had no timber on it. The men of the basin looked at that draw and saw ground you could not farm and could not cut wood on. Ansel looked at it and saw a fire that had been burning since before there were people to warm at it, that no man had to cut, no team had to haul, no road could cut off, and no snow could ever bury. The basin, when he told them, called it foolishness. But knowing that the ground is warm is one thing, and getting that warmth up under a floor where a man can live on it is another. And every stage of it drew fresh amusement from the men stacking their cordwood. Ansel began where the seep came out of the lava, a scalding little run of water that had cut its own steaming channel through the sage and never froze for a rod on either side of it. He and Reuben cut lodgepole up on the rim, not for burning, but for boring, and they augured every log hollow from end to end. Working a long auger by hand and turnabout, hour upon hour, tapering one end and reaming the other, so the logs drove one into the next and held, the same bored log pipe that had carried water under half the mining camps in the West, laid now by a man who wanted the water for nothing but its heat. They ran that wooden line down the fall of the draw, a few feet of drop over a couple of 100 paces, so the water would come on its own and go on coming forever without a pump or a hand laid to it. Then they dug a stone-lined trench the whole length of the floor that was going to be, walled and paved with fitted lava rock, capped with flat slabs set close and true, and floored over with plank. So the hot water would run beneath the boards from one end of the room to the other and pass out into a tail ditch that carried it away, cooled to steam off into the sage. And only when the whole of it ran and the trench was warm end to end did he raise the house, a small, low, single-roomed cabin of squared lodgepole snug over the warm ditch with one plank door, 2 small windows, and no stove in it anywhere at all. Riding past to see their own fine houses rising, the prosperous men chuckled in easy amusement at the 2 old wrecks from the mines down in a ditch in the stinking sulphur mud, fussing over the fall of a wooden pipe, while the last of the good weather went by, and not one cord of wood stood against their wall. The amusement had a leader, and his name was Willard Teague. Teague was the man the basin reckoned had done everything right. He had come in early, taken the ground at the crossing where the freight road came over the creek, and built the finest house in the basin, a big 2-story place of squared timber with a stone chimney at either end and glass in every window. And he had made his money on the one commodity that a high, cold, treeless basin can never have enough of. Willard Teague sold firewood. He held the cutting on the good timber up on the rim, he ran the teams that hauled it down, and every stick of cordwood that warmed a house at the crossing had come off his wagons and been paid for at his price. And against his own wall stood a stack a man could not see over, and beside his fine door hung a fine brass-cased thermometer he had bought off a survey man. And it was Teague, more than any other man, who took the old miner's warm ditch as a kind of affront, for it stood down at the south end of the basin as a plain daily argument that a man could winter in that country without buying a single thing that Teague had to sell. That a man should live there and want no cordwood at all struck Teague as backward and lazy and worse, as a poor example to men who owed him money. The old fool had built himself a house where there was no wood. He would say to anyone warming his hands at the crossing, and had spent the best autumn in years down a hole in the sulphur mud, playing with a wooden pipe, and would be begging a stick off my wagons before the new year, and I have a mind to make him say please. And the men would chuckle in comfortable agreement, and it went round the basin, the crazy old miner, down in the stink at the south end, who had no wood pile and would not last to spring. The strangest part of it, and the part Ansel could never quite make them feel, was that there was nothing novel in any of it, and the basin looked past that only because it had never once had cause to look. Men had been warming themselves off the ground's own heat for as long as there had been men who noticed steam. Whole towns in Japan had wintered for centuries around their hot springs. The Romans had run warm spring water through channels under their floors and left the bathhouses standing all over Europe for anyone to walk through, and in the very country the basin sat in, hot springs were no secret at all. There were bathhouses and plunge houses and hotels built over them. And up in the north of the territory the springs steamed away in plain sight of anyone who passed. Every soul in the basin knew there was hot water in that ground. Not one of them had ever thought of it as anything but a curiosity, a place to soak a bad shoulder, a stink in a draw. The idea that the water was not the point, that the point was the heat in it, and that heat is heat whether it comes off a burning stick or up out of a crack in the lava, and will warm a floor either way, had simply never been put to them, because a man who can buy cordwood has no reason to ask where else warmth might come from. Ansel tried once or twice in his few slow words, and the men heard him and let it go, and went back to stacking their wood, and chuckled at the old man at the south end who was doing a thing the Romans had thought obvious. Ansel let them chuckle, for a basin busy laughing leaves an old man in peace, and there was a winter to get ready for. Through the shortening days, he and Reuben tightened the line and banked the trench and laid in what little they needed. And slowly the big talkative man came round to the small cabin, for it is hard to go on calling a thing a joke when you have slept warm on it for a month while the frost took the basin. And the daily truth of it, once the cold set in, was the whole secret working in plain sight, had any of the amused men cared to ride down and look. There was no fuel burned. None. Not a stick, not an armload, not a cord. There was no stove in the cabin to burn it in, only a small sheet-iron cook-box by the door with a length of pipe out the wall, lit for a half-hour at supper to fry meat and boil coffee, and then let go cold, and never lit at all for warmth, because the floor was warm and had been warm since October and would be warm in April, while every house at the crossing had a man packing wood by the armload from dark to dark and banking the stove against the night. Ansel and Reuben stacked no wood whatever, and the neighbors who rode past that bare wall took the absence of a woodpile for the plainest proof yet that the old man had no idea what country he was living in. There was one other thing a passing man could see. If he looked all around that cabin, out to 20 feet and better, the snow would not lie. The ground stood bare and wet and green-brown and gently steaming in the middle of a white basin all winter, and a tail ditch ran out of it into the sage, smoking like a kettle. They called it the stink hole and rode on by. By the first hard cold of the winter Ansel got his first true proof, though he was near the only man in the basin who marked it for what it was. A sharp still cold came down out of the north in the middle of November, the first real one of the season, and it sat on Kettle Basin for 8 days and searched out every house in it. The crossing burned through that week in a way that made men quiet. The stoves ran day and night and could not be let go down, because the moment a stove goes out, a squared timber house with glass windows gives its warmth up to a high basin in about 2 hours. And so the wood went, hour after hour, faster than any man had figured in the golden weather of September. And when the cold let up at last, and the basin took stock. A good third of the cordwood that was to have carried the crossing to spring had gone in 8 days, in November, with the whole winter still standing in front of it. Teague did well that week. His teams ran the rim road hard, and he sold cordwood at a price he had not dared ask in October. And he told the crossing that a man who had bought early had bought wisely. Ansel and Reuben did not burn one stick of it. They cooked their supper in the sheet iron box and let it go out, and the water came down the board logs at the same heat it had come down at in July, because a hot seep in the lava does not know it is November, and the floor of the little cabin at the south end held exactly as warm on the 8th bitter night as it had on the 1st. Ansel walked the line once in that week to see that nothing had cracked, and marked, as he had expected to, that the ditch had held. There is a particular loneliness in being the only man in a place who trusts a plain fact nobody else has looked at, and Ansel had lived inside it since the first board log went down in the sulphur mud. He bore it more easily than most, for his faith was not truly a faith at all. It was arithmetic, and it was old, and it was only lonely in that one basin in that one season. On the hard, clear nights of that early winter, he would sit late on the warm floor, with his bad shoulder laid flat against the boards, and go over the whole of it again. The way a careful man checks a thing he has staked his life upon. There was nobody in Kettle Basin to grant it a grain of sense. There was only what he had carried up out of the Comstock, that the earth is warm all the way down and never goes out, and that a fire nobody has to feed cannot fail. Every man he could ride to now believed the loud and obvious thing. That warmth lay in the biggest stove and the tallest cordwood stack a man could raise before the snow. The quiet thing that the ground under their feet had been running a fire since before the basin had a name, and would go on running it whether anyone laid a hand to it or not, he alone believed at Kettle Basin. He had chosen long before which of the two he would trust when a winter came to settle the question, and he trusted it now, and slept warm on it while the cold hardened outside. The killing winter came at the deep of the year, and it came in the one shape that could take Kettle Basin apart. It came as snow first and cold behind it. In the last week of December, a great storm rolled down off the divide and did not blow itself out in a night the way the basin storms mostly did. It stood over the country for 3 days and buried it. When it lifted, the sage was gone. The fence lines were gone. The freight road at the crossing was gone, and the rim road, the road to the timber, the only road to the timber. The 2 miles of switchback up onto the benches where every stick of Kettle Basin's firewood grew was under drifts a team could not break and would not break again until March. That was the whole of it, right there, and the basin understood it inside of a day. The wood was up on the rim. The people were down in the basin. And between them lay a snow that no wagon, no team, no sledge, and no amount of Willard Teague's money could get through. Teague sent his teams at it twice in the first week and lost a horse's legs in the crust on the second try and did not send them again. And then, on top of that snow, out of a hard, scoured, cloudless sky, the cold came down and settled, a still, clear, windless killing cold that sank onto the buried basin and deepened at every dawn, day after day after day. 29 days of it without one break, the snow squeaking dry underfoot and the air gone so thin and sharp it hurt to draw. Teague's fine brass thermometer beside his fine door fell past 20 below and past 30 and past 40. And on the worst and stillest of those black mornings, a man could barely stand long enough to read it at 47 degrees below zero, in a basin whose whole supply of firewood was sitting 2 miles away on the other side of a drift. 47 below and 29 days of it on a basin that could not reach its wood. At such a cold held so long, with the road shut, the comfortable arithmetic of the crossing came apart in a way the prosperous men would remember for the rest of their lives. Every house in Kettle Basin was exactly as warm as the wood inside its own walls, and no warmer, and the wood inside its own walls was a number that only ever went down. The fine 2-story houses with the glass windows were the worst of all, for they had the most air to heat and the most wall to lose it through. Men gave up their upstairs to the frost in the first week and their front rooms in the second, and crowded their households into one room around one stove and burned the fence rails, and then the corral poles, and then the barn's loft boards, and then the furniture, good chairs, a bedstead, a walnut table freighted 400 miles at ruinous cost, fed a leg at a time into a stove to buy a night, and still the pile went down. They sat up in shifts to keep the stove alive, because to let it go out was to lose the house, and a man who has burned his last chair has nothing left to burn but the house he is standing in. More than one fine place at the crossing came very near, in those 29 days, to being no shelter at all for the people who had chuckled from its warm veranda at the old man and his ditch. And the cattle in the basin were beyond helping. The herd that had come through the fall fat and promising was scattered and buried and mostly lost, and that winter took the basin's whole stock and its whole savings with it, and the men at the crossing would count from it ever after, calling it simply the winter of '90. Down at the south end, in the small cabin over the warm ditch that the whole basin had chuckled at, Ansel and Reuben were warm. They were not merely getting through it, they were warm, plainly, steadily, almost absurdly warm, and they held so through the first still-killing night, and the 10th, and the 29th, and never once came near failing, because there was nothing in the arrangement that could fail. Every hour of every one of those 29 days, without a hand laid to it, the seep at the head of the draw pushed its scalding water down the board lodgepole line and along the stone trench under the floorboards and out the far end into the tail ditch, exactly as it had in July, exactly as it had for however many thousand years before anyone came to Kettle Basin to laugh at it. It did not know that the rim road was shut. It did not know it was 47 below. It had never needed a man to carry anything to it, and it did not begin needing one now. The two of them sat out the worst winter in the basin's memory on a floor so warm they went about in their shirt sleeves and cracked the door of a morning to let some of the heat out. The door at 47 below. And their fuel consumption for the whole 29 days was a half hour of a sheet iron cookbox at supper time and nothing else whatever. Ansel had carried a thermometer for years, a plain thing off a hardware counter in Virginia City, and he had hung it on the cabin wall at the height of a sitting man's head. On the worst black morning of the whole siege, the morning Teague's fine brass glass down at the crossing stood at 47 below, Ansel woke in the warm dark and looked at it. The needle stood at 74 degrees above zero. 74 in a poor man's one-room cabin with a cold outside that stood the glass at 47 below and would have taken an unsheltered man before daylight. A gulf of 121 degrees held across nothing in this world but a bored lodgepole log, a trench of lava rock, and a sense to build where the ground was already warm. There was no stove in the room. There was no fire in the room. There was no woodpile within 2 miles of the room, and no road to the wood if there had been. The plank floor was hot to a bare foot from the head of the cabin to the door, and Reuben slept easy on the far side of it with the blanket kicked off. No nearer to the killing cold than he had been in August. Ansel looked a while at the needle, then went and cracked the door a hand's width to let the room breathe, and stood in his shirt sleeves in the doorway of a fireless house, watching the basin lie blue and silent in 47 below under the stars, and then went back and lay down on the warm boards and slept. Down at the crossing, the reckoning had come to Willard Teague. He had sold cordwood all through November at the best prices of his life, and he had sold in the plainest terms the wood that was to have wintered his own house. And by the 22nd day of the great cold, with his upstairs and his front room long surrendered to the frost, his fence rails burned and his teams unable to raise the rim, the richest man in Kettle Basin was down to the last of a stack he had once been unable to see over. On a still white morning, he did a thing that a man in a warm room would never have done. He set out on foot for a neighbor's place across the flat, where there was said to be a little wood to spare. A walk of no distance at all that he had made 100 times in easy weather. But judgment is the first thing a great cold takes from a man. The still, savage air pulled the warmth out of him faster than his body could make it, and it took the surety out of his hands and then the strength out of his legs. And a numbing dullness came over his thinking, so that the flat seemed to turn and lengthen and lose its landmarks. He blundered on through the blue, failing light, with the cold climbing his arms. And the one thing he could at last make out in all that brittle white nothing was a low warm glow away at the south end, a soft amber light in 2 small windows, and around it, unmistakable across a mile of frozen snow, a wide dark ring of bare steaming ground standing green in the white waste, the one place in Kettle Basin where the snow would not lie. He made for the stink hole he had laughed at all autumn from his own warm veranda, came at last out of the drift onto bare wet grass and warm mud, and beat on the plank door with a hand he could no longer feel, and the door drew back, and the held heat of that little room rolled out over him into the killing cold like something solid a man could lean his whole weight against. And Ansel's old hands took hold of him and drew him down over the threshold and shut the winter out behind him. They laid him on the warmest part of the floor, where the water came in hottest under the boards, and worked the warmth back into him slowly, the way you must. Reuben chafing his white hands and getting hot coffee into him while the floor gave up its steady heat beneath him. And the fierce pain of the thawing came on and told him he would keep his fingers. And it was while he lay there, warmed from underneath, with the worst cold in the basin's memory, standing 47 below a hand's breadth beyond the log wall, that Teague began to look around the little room for the stove that must surely be making such a heat. There was none. There was no stove and no fireplace and no fire of any kind. There was a cold sheet iron cookbox by the door, with its lid up and gray ash in it from a supper hours gone, and there was no wood in the room, no wood within 2 miles of the room, and no way on earth to have got any if there had been. He put his thawing hand flat on the plank floor and felt the steady, patient. Ground deep heat coming up through it, and he was quiet a long while, a loud man gone wholly silent, working out at last exactly what it was he had been laughing at since September. "There is no stove in it," he said at last, low, as if it were a thing he could not make sit right in his head. "You have no woodpile, Ansel. It is 47 below, and the rim road has been shut for a month, and you have no stove and no woodpile, and I am lying here sweating in my shirt." And Ansel told him only that the ground was warm, that it had always been warm, that it was warm under Teague's own fine house and under every man's boots in the basin, and that all he had ever done was let it up into his floor where it could do some good. And Teague, with the painful heat coming back into his hands, said lower still that he had sold the whole basin its winter by the armload and had never once thought to ask where else warmth might come from, and had said things from his own veranda that he had no business ever to have said. And Ansel, who had no gloating anywhere in him, told him to lie further up toward the head of the room where the boards ran hottest, for there was warmth enough in that ground for a rich fool as well as a poor wise one, and always had been, and it cost nothing. He kept Teague on the warm floor for 4 days and sent him home on the 5th in a milder spell, leaning on Reuben's arm. And before the great cold at last broke, 3 households from the wind scoured North End, their stoves eating the last of their fence rails, came down the drifted flat on the word that there was a warm floor at the South End that needed no wood, and a cabin built for 2 held them all, and stayed warm on exactly what it had always run on, which was nothing. Because the warmth was not in any stack that could be burned down, but in the ground itself, which had nothing in it for a winter to take. When the cold let go at last, and a low, hard sun came up over a silent blue-white basin, the people who came out of Ansel Merrow's door came out warm and whole, and every one of them well, into a basin that had burned its furniture and lost its herd. And the prosperous men of Kettle Basin did not chuckle about the stink hole any more. Teague least of all. In the spring, quietly, with nobody by to watch him do it, he rode down and asked the old miner to show him how a lodgepole was bored true and how a trench was laid so the water would come on its own, and Ansel showed him the whole of it and asked nothing for it. Within 3 years there were 4 houses in that draw and a bathhouse besides. But the story of the winter of '90, the 29 still and killing days behind a snow that shut the timber, when the fine houses at the crossing fed their good chairs into their stoves, a leg at a time, and the old man they had laughed at sat it out in his shirt sleeves at 74 above, with the door cracked and no fire in the house at all, was told up and down that country for as long as there was anyone in Kettle Basin to tell it. They had called it foolishness, right up until the winter came and asked its one hard question, not how much heat a man could make, but whether the heat would still be coming on the day he could no longer go and fetch it, and a stove in a fine cold house had no answer to give, while a warm ditch in a stinking draw answered it all 29 nights long. As they say in that high country, a man's fire is only ever as warm as his next armload, but the ground was here before the wood was, and will be warm long after the last stick is burned, count a house not by the heat it can make, but by the heat that keeps coming when no one is left to carry it. And build where the warmth already is, for the cheapest fire in this world is the one that was already burning before you got there.